Okay, good morning from China, everyone. And this is I would say, a little quicker than expected. My guest today is once again Professor Warwick Powell. And the reason for such a speedy return to the channel is simple. Australians have spoken. And what they've spoken about is their place in the geopolitical jigsaw puzzle. And the reason that we want to talk about this today is that the result, although not surprising because Australians usually demonstrate a fair degree of common sense, they're completely different to the narrative that we're being fed anyway, that the media and the politicians in Australia would like us to believe. So today we'll be finishing on time because we both have other commitments, but I'm incredibly grateful and thank you to Warwick for taking the time out of your busy day to explain this to people, as it is really important. So let's get straight into it with the first question. Essential poll, which I've linked in the description, did, in case anyone wants to check, they went out and they told us that we're being misinformed. They've just published the results of a survey of Australian attitudes on a range of topics related to global issues and Australian foreign policy. Some interesting stuff, very interesting stuff in there. So perhaps you could give us a quick overview, please, Warwick.
Look, absolute pleasure to be with you this morning, Jerry. As you say, the Essential Poll released some very interesting data from its latest fortnightly omnibus survey. So what a lot of polling companies do is that they continually implement polls across a population and just add different questions in during the course of their interviewing. Now, this poll is a survey of 1,126 Australians, and it has been weighted to reflect the demographic mixture of Australians. So it's very standard, it's very mainstream polling procedures and methodologies. And I think we can have a reasonably high level of confidence that the results are reflective of the distribution of attitudes across the population at large. The survey touched on quite a number of questions dealing with issues in the world and Australians' attitudes towards them, mainly in relation to Australia's role in the world, the general state of the world, Australians' attitudes towards how Australia should relate to China, and also some questions concerning what's going on in Gaza. Now, I don't propose to touch the issues in relation to Gaza today. We've got a limited amount of time, but I think it's worthwhile diving a little bit into the other issues. In short, the survey shows that Australians, by and large, view the world as being somewhat or very divided. Now, that probably shouldn't surprise us, but there is no sugarcoating the state of the world from the perspective of the Australian population. In other words, Australians are, as you say, a lot of common sense, but very grounded in what's going on around them and in the world itself. And that sets, I guess, an important backdrop to some of the more specific questions. The survey also asked Australians about how they viewed Australia's role in global affairs. This is one of the really interesting ones, and I guess we'll sort of analyse a little bit more shortly. But in short, the survey found that overall 20% of respondents believe that Australia's role in global affairs should, and I quote, primarily be an ally of the United States. 20%, 1 in 5 Australians. 38%, almost double that, believe that Australia should be an independent middle power with influence in the Asia-Pacific region. 25%, this is the key, 25%, 1 in 4, believe that Australia should, quote, do its best to not engage in the world. So there is actually a fairly substantial isolationist tendency in parts of the Australian population, and 17% are unsure. So that's, I guess, the big picture suggests that the vast majority of Australians, somewhere in the region of 63% or thereabouts, either believe that Australia should behave and pursue the course of being an independent middle power, or try to not get caught up in things to the extent that it can. Right. So that's pretty important. The survey then touched on views about events impacting global stability. The main one of interest to us today is the extent to which, quote, China's expansion into the South China Sea and Taiwan is a cause of concern. Now, 2/3 of respondents said that for them, it was a cause of concern in terms of these factors impacting global stability. Australia's relationship with China, 2/3, again, very, very substantial majority of people believe that Australia's relationship with China is complex and needs to be managed. 1 out of 5 sees it as a threat that must be confronted, and 13% sees it as positive and one that should be pursued for the positive aspects to be realised. So that's your big picture, that the world's unstable, that Australia would rather Australia either be an independent middle power or do its best to not get caught up in things. There are concerns around what's happening in the South China Sea and Taiwan, but that's not driving an attitude that says China's a threat that needs to be confronted. Rather, what that's supporting is a view that Australia's relationship with China is complex and needs to be managed. That's the big picture.
So before we get on to the next questions, one I want to add, why do you think, because I live in China and I don't think China is a threat to either Taiwan or the South China Sea, and is definitely not a threat to Australia. What makes people think that?
Look, there's no doubt that there has been an incredible amount of both mainstream media coverage around the issues, together with fairly incessant drip feeding of information from the mainstream defence and insecurity industry, if you will, plus sections of the political elite. So there has been, over the last 4 to 5 years, a very concerted effort from sections of the defence and insecurity establishment to promote the idea that there is something going on in the South China Sea and something going on in relation to Taiwan that is a source of instability. So that's certainly permeated into the attitudes that Australians have towards the impact of these issues and their perceptions around global stability.
So the perception has become a reality, effectively.
Well, yes. And that it starts to help us understand, I guess, how it is that many Australians start to rationalise, if you will, or think through how they believe Australia should position itself in relation to these issues.
All right, let's move on to talk about, because it's quite important, the gender and the age differences holding different opinions.
Look, this is the fascinating bit. When you dive into the survey report will actually enable people to look at this themselves through the link that you've provided.
Yep.
But the survey results are presented as overall for the entire population surveyed, and then it breaks it down by either gender, male and female, and it also breaks it down by 3 age cohorts, so 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. And across the 4 issues that we've touched on, there are some very interesting age and or gender-based variations in attitudes. So if we look at the question of the extent to which people believe the world is divided or not, what we find is that older people, those 55 and over, are substantially more likely to believe that the world is divided. So 77% of people aged 55 and over, 3/4 believe that the world's divided. And conversely, the younger age cohort, 18 to 34-year-olds, are substantially less likely to believe that, so only 50%. So 57% of the younger cohort and 70% of the older cohort. So we see that as people get older, they are tending to see the world in more divided terms. They're really, I guess, a little bit more concerned or anxious about the fragmentation of the world than is the younger population. The other point I should make is that the younger population groups and the middle age groups, the 35 to 54 age groups, are also substantially more ambivalent, neither united nor divided. So 29% of the younger age group and 20% of the middle age group believe that the world is neither united nor divided, compared to 18% of the old ones. So the older age group, much clearer in terms of the world being divided and far less ambivalent than the other age groups.
Do you think that might have something to do with education? I remember when I left school, I'm 65, so I'm in that age group where we mostly believe that there is an issue. When I left school, it was quite a large school, but only 2 of my class went on to higher education, and 20 or 30 of us went out to work. And that was quite normal back in those days. Now, of the people that I'm still in touch with, many of them never, ever went further with their education. They got a job in a factory, in a shop. Some of them joined the military. I joined the police, and then eventually I got a better education, and then higher education even. But would it be that education factors into this, do you think?
I think they're interesting questions, and of course, survey data doesn't give us any basis to lead to any particular set of conclusions. I think you're right in generally painting the picture that across the Australian population, a higher proportion of younger people have a higher level of education than the older cohorts. I think so that there's potentially something there. I think the other thing that's interesting to reflect on, even if we can't reach definitive conclusions statistically, is that we also know that different age cohorts get their information and news about the world through different means. So the older the population is, the more likely it is to continue to receive its news from the mainstream traditional media channels. And the younger you are, the more likely you are to get them from social media and from independent news and information sources.
Yeah. Perhaps you could make a suggestion to the Essential List and see if they can add that question: where do you get your media from, or where did you get your education from? Those 2 really do highlight something that I think needs further investigation. The next question that I had, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that in statistical analysis, which was my background in a previous life, we have a technique which we call cross-tabulation, which is essentially looking at the relationships between 2 different things, so age groups and for instance, an attitude on something. And at the moment, we only have a limited amount of information based on this poll as to the nature of the respondents. And if we are to drill in, I think it'd be a great suggestion would be to ask the guys at Essential that perhaps in a future implementation of the survey that they explore some of these issues, because I think that there is something there around education and also around where you get your information from.
Yeah. So I put this little point up made by John Doe. I think media saturation still works. It's clear that media saturation and Australian media is saturated, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. And you and I have both written for one of them, at least, Pearls and Irritations. They're often publishing yours. They're often publishing mine. They're the only exception that I know of. Michael Westbiz is economy based, but also a little bit of an exception. And apart from that, even to me anyway, even the non-mainstream still fit along the narrative of China. But that's probably because they're not focusing on China. If they were to, they would find the truth because they look for it. Media saturation still works, but the Achilles heel is that when the threat narratives don't eventuate, they will fade. And I think that's possibly true of the younger people. They, like me, I've been saying, well, hasn't Iran been on the cusp of having a nuclear bomb in the next few weeks for how many years? I mean, I've been hearing this for years. So I don't believe that Iran is on the cusp of having a nuclear bomb anymore. Or perhaps they are on the cusp of having a nuclear bomb, but they haven't been for the last 20 years that I've been hearing it.
Look, something
What do you think?
I guess very interesting around how the mainstream media over probably the last 10 to 15 years has progressively narrowed its way of framing the world to a point where a lot of the issues in the world are captured in very caricaturized terms. So we generally have very cliche-driven caricatures. The descriptors, which are often obligatory, you got to paint somebody as bad, as good. So it's very millenarian. It's very black and white. It's very dualist. Good, bad, evil, virtuous, threat, peaceful, ally, enemy, those sorts of things. And yet, clearly, the world itself it occupies a lot of the shades of grey, and actually very rarely ever occupies either of those extremes. And the survey tends to suggest that there is a sensibility in the population at large, the fact that the world is actually quite a lot greyer than the mainstream media caricatures are concerned.
Yeah. Do you think that this, this is one of a fortnightly survey, but because this focused on geopolitical activities, if that's the right word, do you think that this has proven that media and politicians and their narrative has been usurped by this takeaway?
There is certainly a disconnect. And if I was paying for those running the mainstream narrative with a view to influencing attitudes across the population, I'd probably be wanting my money back at this stage. It is clear that there is a disconnect between the mainstream narrative and the mainstream framing and the way that the majority of Australians are viewing the state of the world. Now, the idea of an unstable world, of course, isn't just a mainstream proposition, though a lot of the mainstream narrative talks about us living through a period of substantial change and tumult. But I don't think that there is anybody in the spectrum overall that would suggest that the world is all kumbaya at this stage.
Oh,
the other thing about the mainstream narrative that I think, again, if I was funding this as a narrative, as a persuasion piece, I'd be wanting my money back, is that the overall tenor of Australian public attitudes towards our relationship to the world and how we should conduct ourselves is certainly not falling behind the sub-imperial deputy sheriff kind of proposition that is being advanced by certain quarters. So that narrative or that line of argumentation has not bitten, if you will. Over 60% of Australians either want to, try to steer clear of things. That's 25% of people. They want to steer clear of it if you can. Stay out of it. Keep away from it.
I think that this is an important thing that we'll need to come back to. I'll just put this up for a moment. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Far away.
Well, my question relating to this is Joel from Sweden. He says, what Australia wants is irrelevant. Now, when you're in the Northern Hemisphere of the United States, perhaps you view Australia as irrelevant. I see this very differently. Australia has a very important role to play in Asia, not necessarily as part of Five Eyes, but as part of ASEAN, as part of the kind of Asian community. What do you reckon about this? Is Australia irrelevant?
The former Greek finance minister and well-known academic economist, commentator, political activist Yanis Varoufakis, a couple of days ago actually spoke at the National Press Club here in Australia, and his starting remarks very early in his delivery was that Europe and Australia actually share a number of things, and one of those is that both of them are becoming increasingly irrelevant. So perhaps there is some reverberation, if you will, of that general sense And he said that in large part because both Europe and Australia in their own ways have subordinated themselves to the interests of another party, in his argument, the United States. So in part, of course, if you're describing the world as it is today, I think there is an argument to say that in large part, Australia has dealt itself out of the influence game because it's actually dealing itself into the sub-imperial game.
Right.
That said, the question is an alternative possible? And I guess we can reflect a bit upon that during the course of this conversation to explore a little bit more what Joel, your viewer, has actually commented, which is, what Australia wants is irrelevant. And I would suggest that there's a few layers to this. One is that what Australians want in relation to its governments is one aspect of the question. What the government and the political elite today want is another aspect. And ultimately, what the overarching drivers and levers which are shaping Australian public policy vis-a-vis the region and the world, that's another story again.
Okay. So Joel has clarified this. He didn't mean that Australia is irrelevant. That was my interpretation of that. Sorry, Joel. But what he means is what they want is not being given consideration by the people who want something else, I guess, particularly on the other side of the Pacific.
And I think he's right in that there's a lot of forces within the political elite and the defence and insecurity apparatuses of the United States and in Australia. In the US, people often describe that as the blob, right?
The blob
inside the beltway. And to some extent, you could probably say that in Australia we have something like a mini blob or a mini me. And for those people, the present state of attitudes probably says two things to them. One is that there'll be frustration that the efforts made over the last few years haven't really turned the Australian population in behind them fully. That's the first thing that there would be, I think, frustration and disappointment in. And that's the I'd want my money back proposition from me.
Yep.
But the other part is how you respond to that. And I suspect that the blob or the mini blob, their instinct will be to double down, right? The reason why the Australian population hasn't swung in behind in the way that they had hoped for is simply because they haven't done enough. So they'll do more of the same, but try and do more of it.
Right. So you mentioned the word sub-imperial a little while ago. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Look, the idea of sub-imperial was developed and articulated by a Professor Clinton Fernandez out of Sydney. And Professor Fernandez is a former Australian intelligence officer, somebody who has been deeply enmeshed in his professional life, either at the coalface end of security and intelligence or as a research academic. And he published a book a couple of years ago called Sub-Imperial Power, which sought to understand and explain Australian foreign policy. And he coined this idea of sub-imperial power to distinguish Australia's particular approach to foreign policy from the suggestions that Australia is a middle power or that it is a lackey. So the idea of Australia being a lackey basically is that it'll just do what it's told because it has no choice and those sorts of things. The idea of Australia being a middle power suggests that it kind of is disconnected from the umbilicus of the Washington blob. And for him, neither of those really explains Australian foreign policy over the ages. So sub-imperial actually says something like, and I hope I do his line of thinking justice when I summarise it, that the political elite, the defence and insecurity industry elite in Australia have developed over many decades a view that Australia's security interests are 100% served by the maintenance of American primacy. And therefore, it is in Australia's interests that primacy be either sustained or, if it is weakening, to be reinforced and reclaimed. So that's the idea of sub-imperial. It's not that Australia gets told what to do and it behaves as a lackey, and it certainly doesn't have what people would call agency to go and do what it really may wish to do alternatively, but does consciously and over time becomes far more subconscious, a reflective, an institutionally reflective or reflective response to the world, which is American primacy is good for Australia, and therefore we must do everything we can to back it up. That's sub-imperial behaviour.
Well, this is a little unrelated, but I think it's an important question from James. I'm sure he says, I'm sure Warwick is aware of the collapse of traditional Labour values. And I've noticed this, particularly in the UK, where I was born. Any likelihood of a resurgence? I think in the UK, we're starting to see it with the Workers' Party of Great Britain suddenly winning a seat, finally winning a seat, I would say. But the Workers' Party of Great Britain are growing, and that is kind of more socialist, kind of more what Labour started out doing over 100 years ago. Do you think that's I mean, this is a little unrelated to what we're talking about, but I think with Labour in power right now, it's worth considering this.
Well, I guess look, I'll dive into this a little bit, because this question of Labour values is quite an interesting one. But I'll start with the present and then work back. Many of your viewers will know that over the course of the last 12 months, particularly in relation to the AUKUS question, the Australia, UK, US agreements around obviously nuclear submarines, but other things, that has provoked some very critical reactions from a number of very prominent members of the Labour movement here in Australia, not least of which was former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who has on various occasions now been a very outspoken critic with the usual flair and elan that he brings to the conversation. Unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream reaction to that focused upon style rather than substance, but perhaps it was a nice way to ignore the substance by focusing on the style. Now, for what it's worth, without the style, I don't think it would quite have had the same effect, right? So it's not just throwing a rock into the pond, it's how he threw the rock into the pond that grabbed the public attention.
He is quite unique at high levels.
But since then, we've had a number of senior figures in the Labour movement speak out against the AUKUS arrangements in favour of a more independent foreign policy. So we've had the letter signed, the joint letter led by, but not only, signed by former foreign ministers Bob Carr and Gareth Evans, both were foreign ministers. We've had Peter Garrett, a former environment minister, cabinet minister in the Rudd Labor government, speak out. We've had Doug Cameron, who was also a senior figure in the Labour movement, and also a strong voice within the Parliamentary Labour Party during the Rudd years and Gillard years. He's now, I think from memory, chairing Labour Against War movement within the Labour movement. So there has been a resurgence, if you will, from parts of the Labour movement in relation to these issues. That said, I think what this speaks to is that, in fact, the Labour movement has many threads to it. So the idea of Labour values alone is probably a little bit all-encompassing, and I'd suggest that the Labour movement itself has many threads of history. And if you go back 100 years now, we have a split in the Labour movement on the question of conscription, around the First World War. We've had questions around Australia's attitudes towards communism in the Labour movement. So during the 1950s and then into the 1960s, the labour movement split over the question of communism and the Communist Party in Australia. And that, of course, all happened in the context of a Cold War environment where issues of domino theory and Reds under the bed was quite prominent. So as to whether this is a collapse of traditional labour values, my suggestion would be that traditional labour values actually has many dimensions to it, and there is much in the labour tradition that people can draw upon to think through these issues. But there's also parts of the labour tradition which are very much all the way with the US of A sort of stuff as well.
Fair enough. Okay, so that's very interesting that there's a lot more to that than just, I tend to think of it as kind of labour values is more about the working man, but which is to my opinion, eroding.
Well, just quickly on that one, Jerry, the other point around the economic question is that in Australia particularly, there has been a long-standing set of tensions in the labour movement, but also more broadly in the body politic around free traders versus protectionists. And in fact, political parties were formed around precisely that policy divide. So, and inside the labour movement itself, there are free traders and protectionists. So again, they had very distinct views about how best to prosecute the interests of the working class. So a concern for the working class may have been the unifying thread, if you will, or the philosophical umbrella. But once you delve into it, you'll actually find that there's a lot of heated debates as to exactly how best to do that.
Interesting. So let's move back to the main topic that we're here for, and let's assume for one moment that the political party in power adopts some common sense, looks at this essential list, and says, "Well, there might be something here. Let's look a little deeper into this." And they look a little deeper, and they find that this poll is accurate, which I think it probably is. It's an accurate reflection of a very small part of society, but quite a wide scope. So let's assume for a moment that they listen to this. What do they need to do if they're going to listen to this and become? How do they graduate from where they are now? Which I'm seeing words like lackey and booklicker and vassals, these kinds of things. How do they graduate from that to become a middle power in this region?
Look, this in many ways defines both the strategic and also the operational tensions that exist in the foreign policy and defence and security regimes that we have today. Mm-hmm. And we see that in the way that the policy and the rhetoric often butt up against each other. So on the one hand, there is continual rhetorical deference to the idea of an increasingly unstable and risky region. There is a clear policy intent to support an attempt to revive or sustain and defend American primacy in the region. And that's really revolves around the AUKUS apparatus, if you will. But on the other hand, you have a foreign policy that talks about the need to progress and advance work within a context that recognises plurality in the region, multipolarity in particular, and that the policy objective is strategic equilibrium. So that's the new phraseology, if you will. Prior to the election, the current foreign minister talked a lot more about multipolarity in Asia and ASEAN centrality and things. But after the election, the rhetoric has focused a lot more on this idea of strategic equilibrium. Now, having to flesh those ideas out, I think, is firstly the challenge. So to go to your question, how does one make the move? Well, to make the move in many ways requires a very substantial framing of how Australia views itself, how Australia views the region and what's going on in the region, and therefore how Australia views its relationship to the region. I think that context of debates and arguments, if you will, are happening right now. It's clear that inside the elite establishment of policymakers in this space, that the preponderance of views is that policy needs to be tilted towards Australia as a sub-imperial power. And that draws on and reflects a lot of historical muscle memory, if you will, within the institutions of state. But as these other realities, you talked earlier about how at some point, as realities keep dripping, like water on a stone, that the public policy framework must yield at some point to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to take time whilst these debates and issues unfold. And what will change that? Well, public opinion, in part, I think, helps condition that, because if the public doesn't buy in to a particular narrative frame, then at some point you run the risk that you'll lose the public as you pursue a particular trajectory. And that's a problem for the political class. So that's one part of it.
Do you think there's a possibility that's already happened? The public have
certainly
lost interest in the democratic process. Certainly, I see this in America. The 28% of the populace, or the available registered voters, put Joe Biden in position. 28%, I think it was. Very, very low number.
Look, there's certainly a basis in the polity, if you will, for a political elite to reshape its policy posture. I don't think the establishment, if you will, or the political parties. In fact, the essential poll actually breaks down the data by party affiliation too. But I didn't go into that because I didn't really want to cloud, the discussion with party politics per se.
Right.
But the population at large, I think, is actually quite capable of accepting a shift in policy emphasis from one that sees Australian policy in sub-imperial terms to one that actually says, let's start forging what begins to look like a more independent middle power posture. I don't think that there's going to be any real skin lost by anybody who does that. Sure, a section of the community and the very vocal voices within the insecurity establishment are no doubt going to have something to say about it. As I said earlier, that particular political force, if you will tend to respond to this sort of survey by doubling down, right?
Yeah.
But if you're in the business of formulating public policy, then I think that there's lots in this survey that gives you comfort that a shift can occur without actually rubbing the population up the wrong way. That's a good start. The other thing, of course, is plain old reality. So plain old reality is starting to suggest very clearly that there's a lot more to the AUKUS submarine deal than meets the eye. And there's two parts of this. One is the strategic question, should or shouldn't Australia go down this path? And the other one is an operational execution problem, which is even if you thought Australia should go down this path, is it going to be able to execute this effectively? And of course, if you can't execute effectively, or there's lots of risks around executing this effectively, then it must cause people to start to reflect on that strategic decision. Because there's no point.
That's already come to the fore, hasn't it? The US has pulled back their Virginia-class submarine construction, and it looks like AUKUS is a non-starter.
Well, there's a lot to this, right? So over the last 12 months, there's been an ongoing debate in the Congress actually around America's own priorities, which affects Australia because the priority setting around resource commitments to this particular class of vessel is actually coming from Washington and coming from Congress, not coming from Canberra. So ultimately, what happens is going to get decided by those in Congress. That's the first thing. Congress is confronting some perspectives on reality that go to America's own productive capabilities versus what Congress itself views as America's own requirements. So America or Congress has a view that America needs a certain amount of capability going forward. And to do that, it needs to be able to build that. Right now, its submarine industry is well short of being able to meet its own needs. So that creates a constraint that is plain old-fashioned reality. And that's going to affect how Washington views the prioritization of its resources. So a lot of this is actually outside of Australia's control. So that's quite an interesting proposition, isn't it? That, in fact, much of the pathway from a turn it into reality point of view is actually not in Australia's control. That's the first thing. The second thing comes down to the myriad of risks associated with actually being able to pull this off. So even if the decision made in Congress was to commit resourcing to the manufacture of a bunch of submarines for the Allies in the Antipodes, making that happen on time, on budget, without problems, is actually a very challenging endeavour. These are complex construction, building, engineering activities. And Michael West, mentioned, has a piece on his website from Rex Patrick, a former senator and a former submariner, who actually outlines very clearly the project management risks associated with delivery. So again, put aside the strategic question, yes or no. For starters, can it even be done? What are the risks involved? And once you get your head around that, you start to say, well, maybe committing almost all the eggs into this strategic decision actually involves incredible risk in itself.
Let's go on to the final question that I had in my list here. There's a couple of other questions come up here.
Sure.
What can the Australian people do, and where does this place Australia in terms of its military and trade agreements? I'm thinking particularly in trade agreements such as AUKUS and ASEAN and RCEP, which is basically an Asian or South. It's regional cooperation economic partnership. So what can Australians do in relation to this?
First and foremost, I think it behoves Australians to find out as much as they can about these issues. That's the first thing. To look beyond the sort of 8-second grab and to dive a little bit deeper. And I think on the basis of survey results we've been discussing, there is plenty of room for the Australian population to actually do that and to interpret what they find as they dig deeper within a very commonsensical or practical framework. That's the first thing. I think the second thing as a result of that is for Australians who are passionate and concerned about Australia's role in the world and in particular in our region to look for channels where there are voices that are being aired even today that put these issues onto the agenda, whether it's the Australians for War Reform, who are asking the question and in fact putting forward proposals that say Australia shouldn't be going to war on the basis of a decision made by one, which is what happens today. The question of going to war is a question that the Parliament should address before going to war, not after. So, Australians for War Reform is something for people to better understand. There are a number of peace movements that I think Australians who are concerned about this would be well advised to find out more about. And again, I look at the survey. The majority of Australians either want to try to stay out of the trouble, so they want a peaceful world, and by not meddling in it and stirring the pot, or they want to be influential in the region as an independent middle power. So to get to that point, to get to that point, they need to become better informed and to find the channels through which they can articulate their concerns and voices. Because there are very good reasons, it seems to me now, that the risks
I will into
high.
the description of this. There are two things you've mentioned. One is the war powers reform, and I spoke just the other day to Cameron Leckie, who's part of that, and the other one is the IPAN. I think it's the Independent Peaceful Australian Network, IPAN. I'll put links to both of those. I subscribe to IPAN and I get regular emails from them. And they are informing, and they're informing with very informed people. And Rex Patrick is one of those. I mean, an ex-submariner who does know this stuff. Go on.
So I guess the other thing is that we can sort of get quite obsessed with the question around hardware and that sort of stuff. But I think the other issue that people would be well advised, if you will, to begin to think hard about and to ask of the political establishment to actually think hard about is not just the question of military deterrence, because that's just a manipulation of your risk environment that at best buys you time. Mm-hmm. The real challenge, if Australia is to be a constructive middle power, independent middle power with influence in the Asia Pacific, is how it plays a role that supports the collaborative design and realization of the institutions of lasting regional peace. That's the practical objective, if you will, of being an independent middle power with influence in the region, which is to influence the institutions and the actions of all, including your own, that go towards bolstering a region that prioritizes peace, stability, and prosperity as a package deal.
Do you think Australia has the government to do that now? I haven't put them up here, but I've seen a couple of comments that say that the Labour Party in the past, and they've mentioned names like Bob Hawke, John Kerr, these people were CIA's men. Do you think that the Labour Party today has been infiltrated? Probably that's a stupid question to ask, and let's not go there because it's all opinion. But do you think that the Labour Party has the ability to do this and step away from America?
As I mentioned earlier, there are many traditions or many threads in the Labour tradition in Australia. And some of those threads give sustenance to the alternative frames, which is around this idea of being an independent middle power as opposed to being a sub-imperial power. Now, these arguments are taking place right now inside the Labor Party, inside the Labor, whether it's the unions or the Parliamentary Labor Party or sub-branches within the broader Labor Party movement. How this plays out, well, time will tell, and who knows. But there is, I think, the emergence of an awareness. Early days yet, but there is an emergence of an awareness. Firstly, that the framing of the world as we see it today and Australia's role within it is not a lay down misère. The idea that the world is unstable, I think that is accepted by everybody. How we deal with that is actually up for grabs. More than one way of responding to these challenges. So that's the first thing. So I think the terrain is open for an alternative framing. Now we've got to start to have conversations about what those alternative framings could look like. How that plays out through the institutions of collective decision making, whether it's at the parliamentary level or wherever. Well, again, time will tell. That will come down to, in part, what happens in Washington, particularly in November this year, and how that shapes the public discourse in Washington. Because let's not forget, what Washington does has a massive effect on the ways in which the Australian public policy elite actually think about the world. Right? For some, there is already, you see this in the social media landscape in terms of how some of the main voices are reacting, that as President Trump is talking about changing America's posture towards financing its allies and being involved in various conflicts here, there, and everywhere, there's a great deal of concern amongst those who've hitched their wagon to the traditional neocon agenda. An incredible amount of concern. There are those who are actually saying, well, this actually enforces or creates a space that mandates Australia, if you will, to think afresh. And this, again, may open up the opportunity for a different conversation about how we deal with the uncertainties of the world and an Australian predilection to either being an independent middle power with influence in the region, or a more passive position that seeks not to meddle and get involved.
I see a little bit of a dichotomy that Australia has. If Australia as a government wants to be that middle power, as a government, I'm talking about not the people seem to want it, but if the government says, yeah, this is a good idea, this is where we should be, and that would be following Paul Keating's guide, if you like. The issue that I see is that most of their advice in the government at the most senior levels in the defense and what you call the insecurity industry, in those areas, most of their advice is actually coming from Washington or paid for by Washington. Do you think that can ever change?
In the context of Australian political institutions, there's always going to be a heavy hand from Washington. I don't think that is something that is likely to change in the short term or the medium term. But again, I stress that in the Australian tradition, that is not the only thread, and there are other threads that can be drawn upon. It does require a certain level of self-belief, confidence in the capacity of this nation to be independent. And to do that requires a modicum of courage and a big dose of imagination. Now, all of those things have from time to time percolated to the surface. So it's not beyond the capacity of this country and its people and its institutions to pursue a pathway that seeks security and prosperity as an Asian nation, as opposed to pursuing those things detached from Asia. Right? What we've got to overcome, in a sense, is that dualism that says Australia's attitudes towards China in particular is framed by a combination of greed and fear. And that's how former Prime Minister Tony Abbott described things to Angela Merkel some years ago. We've got to get over that framing. It's not about fear, nor is it about greed. It's about being a constructive participant and contributor to collective security and sustained prosperity for all.
I've been quite disappointed, I would have to say, with both Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. When they came in, I mean, I didn't expect a complete turnaround. I expected there would be some changes. And we have actually seen some concessions. I think, this is my opinion, I think they are involved in quiet diplomacy in the background. And I think they are probably very well aware that they can't make changes. They have a very hostile media, and they still have a hostile media. We still see, I've noticed this, the ABC will quote opposition members rather than, the members of the opposition party rather than members of the sitting party, the ruling party. And I've found that quite a lot. Do you think that they are just biding their time, waiting for something? Or do you think that this really is, they're encapsulated or captured by the American system?
The short answer is no idea. But I think that, again, let's go back to what this survey shows, or what the space that's created by what we've learned from this survey, and that is that the population at large is actually looking for something a little bit different or substantially different from what appears to be the predominant perspective from the political establishment. So that creates considerable room. I guess the issue, and I go back to our earlier remarks, that there is quite evidently a divide or a disconnect between the views and priorities as articulated by the political and policy elite and the perspectives that we're starting to see percolate through surveys like this. Mm-hmm. So there's a divide. So if you're interested in being able to make adjustments to the current policy posture, and you felt hemmed in by the mainstream media, on the one hand, a febrile opposition on the other who will latch onto anything and try and paint you into a corner. Well, what you've got going for you against all of that is a population that's actually far more open to an alternative discourse. That's the opportunity window.
That's why I see this particular poll, the one that we're talking about today, is probably a watershed moment. It gives them that opportunity to say, well, first of all, we didn't know this, because I don't think many people did. I certainly didn't know this. I've got a very good friend who's just come back from Australia. He's been back just 3 or 4 weeks now. And he said everyone he talks to is talking about when, not if, but when China invades. China's going to invade Australia. And he said, everyone's talking like this. Now, in his community, I guess that everybody is. But in fact, what we're finding here is completely the opposite. There are a lot of people talking about we don't need this kind of conflict, and China is not the threat that we thought it was.
Well, if you go back to the survey on the question of whether China is a threat that needs to be confronted, what we find is that first and foremost, the majority of people actually don't think it's a threat to be confronted. 67%, 2 out of every 3 Australians, believes that the relationship with China is complex and needs to be managed. 1 in 5, 20%, thinks that's a threat. That's the first thing. But when you drill into it, we actually find that women are actually more likely to see the relationship as complex, requiring management. 72% versus 61% men.
Right.
So that's one. So there's an interesting demographic difference there. And conversely, men are actually more likely to see China as a threat that needs to be confronted, 23% versus 18%. Okay. Though interestingly, also, men are more likely than women to see the relationship as positive, the positive one to be realized. So men are a lot more polarized, if you will, in terms of attitudes, but nonetheless, 60-odd percent, 61% see it as complex and needing management. The age group stuff is actually is interesting as well. And that is that amongst that 18 to 34-year-old age group, it's pretty evenly divided as to whether China is an opportunity or a threat. 17% see it as an opportunity, 18% see it as a threat, and 65% see it as complex and requiring management. So again, there's a lot there in the Australian population's instincts in relation to China that suggests that there's plenty of support for a policy that is far more calibrated around acknowledging complexity and explaining what that complexity is and how Australia addresses that, rather than viewing it as a threat that needs to be confronted. Only 1 in 5 Australians see China as a threat to be confronted. Now, that's the raw material from a public attitudes perspective, that those who believe that peace in the region is actually something important to work towards, to work with.
Yeah, so maybe Anwar Ibrahim's comments the other day where he said, we don't see China as a threat, that might have helped. I don't know if that was the right timing, but certainly if Malaysia don't see China, and there are a lot of Chinese people who live in Malaysia, that's for sure, or Chinese ethnicities or ethnically Chinese people who live in Malaysia. But the fact is that one of our nearest neighbors with massive resources of its own feel no threat from China. Why would one of our far neighbors, as F. Liu just said, why the F would China do that? And the honest thing is that China has no reason to do this. It's been trading with Australia for the last 60 years and doing very, very well. Maybe a little less than 60 years, but around that period of time, it's been doing very well. Australia has done incredibly well out of the growth of China's economy. Australia is probably the world's greatest beneficiary of China's economic growth, other than China, I would think. Why would this be necessary? Why would it be considered necessary?
Well, and so I guess if you've been funding the campaigns, or you've been running the campaigns that seek to amplify China threat proposition, try to create fear in relation to China, you'd be wanting your money back. This survey shows very strongly that despite an incredible amount of effort put into prosecuting this line of argument, that it hasn't percolated beyond about 1 in 5 Australians.
Pretty good, isn't it?
Well, this is not what you'd call a great return on investment from a propaganda point of view. And that's raw material, if you will, in a population to work with. If you actually believe that Australia would be better off and the region as a whole would be better off if we worked collaboratively towards designing, implementing, and living with institutions that are geared towards collective security and collective prosperity, as opposed to this idea that we have a threat that we must either, fight off or deter. I mean, it really shows that this entire militarized and securitized discourse over the last few years about our region has not had the effect that I'm sure many who run these lines have wanted to achieve.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing that I don't know how many Australians know where Taiwan is, but I've actually had people on my feed and in the comment section telling me, as soon as they're finished with Taiwan, they're rolling across to Australia. And I'm not sure if they realize that Taiwan is only 130 kilometers away from here, not from where I'm sitting. It's about 1,000 kilometers away. But from the coast of China, Taiwan is 130. And from the coast of China, Australia is 10,000, I don't know, 9,000, 10,000 kilometers away. It's not like China even has the military capacity to launch an invasion, not even of Taiwan. If they were going to do that, they've got the wrong ships for it. But if they were going to launch a military invasion, certainly Australia is a lot further away than the Philippines. It's a lot further away than Indonesia. It's a lot further away than Malaysia and all of Southeast Asia, which if they were going to expand, that's where they would expand to, because all the resources that Australia has are available in Asia too.
So, it comes down to this question again of narratives to some extent frame realities. And then there happens to be another reality, which is reality. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard actually called that the sacramental order, that there's something actually far more sacred, if you will, about this thing called reality than we often give it credit for. And for your viewers who of a certain vintage, they might recall the Matrix movie, which of course was a movie about the relationship to different realities. And the main character in that, Neo, used to store his cards in a box masquerading the book. And that book is called Simulacra and Simulacrum by Jean Baudrillard. So in a sense, the story here is that there's a simulation of reality that's constantly being played out through these caricatures and cliches, particularly around threats and how the other is demonized. That's one. And then there's a sacramental order, which just doesn't sink. And the further apart these two realities come, the narrative reality of caricatures and cliches from the sacramental order, the less believable it is. And it seems that despite these incredible efforts and resources put into running this threat line over the last 4 to 5 years in particular, it hasn't delivered the results. The Australian community at large is a little bit immune, if you will, to this extent of simulation.
I've seen lots of reports since I've been paying attention in the last 3 years or so. Before that, I didn't pay much attention, I'll be honest. It wasn't my field. I got into this about 3 years ago. And since then, I've been seeing lots of reports about how imminent the threat is. And it is an imminent threat. Well, it's not an imminent threat because it was imminent 3 years ago. It was an imminent threat 2 years ago. It was an imminent threat last year, and still it's an imminent threat. And I've even seen reports saying they will take over Taiwan. China will take over Taiwan before the end of this year. And that was last year. So it still hasn't happened. And that must have put into some critical thinking minds an element of doubt that this narrative is even true, let alone likely to happen anytime in the near or distant future.
Well, this is the thing, the simulation and then the simulation of the simulation. Because what tends to happen, as no doubt you've observed, is that a lot of those who are inside the sort of echo chamber, if you will, actually end up talking to each other, and they create their own simulation of the simulation. And yet out there in the wider world, there is a different order of reality. And as the distance between these continues to grow, there are people who end up, in effect, taking the red pill and seeing an alternative reality. I'm not saying that the alternative reality is better or worse than the fictions in the narratives and in the cartoons and things, in effect, that are being concocted. But it is a reality that actually matters more.
And it is
the
different.
reason is that the others within our region, the other countries, you mentioned Anwar Ibrahim, for example, they're operating with a different view of reality. And therefore their behaviours and how that matters to Australia, for example, is being shaped by a very different view, if you will, than the view that is advanced by the political elite here. Now, that view that China is a threat that must be confronted is only accepted as a proposition by 20% of Australians, 1 in 5. Now, I don't have at my fingertips whether that view's changed over the last so many years, but given that the campaigns from a media level, the number of books, the work of politicians, the work of various hawks and others to prosecute a particular view of the world and a particular view about China as threat, China as risk, and all those sorts of things, given the resources committed to that, a 20% result is a very disappointing outcome.
Yeah.
From my perspective, it just tells us that there is a capacity for people to actually realize that there is a difference between the simulation and the sacramental order.
That's the takeaway from today's discussion. I'm very conscious of the time here, and I know you've got another one to go to very soon. I just wanted to summarize. And first of all, before summarizing, I've got a couple of questions here. Am I gonna approach the TikTok issue, the ban in America? Yes, I am going to talk about that. I think it's ridiculous, but there's a lot more underlying to that story, and I'll make a video, write a script about that fairly soon. Banking in the US, someone said we need a postal bank. The same thing applies in Australia. The Citizens Party are working very hard to achieve that. So there's a couple of questions there that came in. They weren't related to what we were talking about today, so I didn't bring them up. But in summary, what we have here is basically a survey, a polling of Australian people, which has a good methodology, quite an accurate response, and it's pretty much telling us that the narrative that China is a huge threat to Australia is not quite what we thought it was, that most people realize that China is a complex relationship, it's a difficult relationship, and it needs managing. We think that could help the politics to move forward and kind of avoid the hostile opposition, hostile media, because it's what the people would rather see. Would that summarize things for us?
Absolutely. It creates the space that people need to actually, in a sense, provided they've got the courage and the imagination to actually step forward to craft new possibilities.
Let's hope they find the courage and the imagination and the creativity and the innovation, all the things that they need in order to make this world a safer place, because it could be a very stable place. Just imagine if everything you read about China was not true. We'd have a much more stable world. Simple as that. And if everything I'm reading about China is true, I'm in the wrong country. This is a terribly dangerous place to be. So clearly, I don't think that is true. So on that happy note, any parting shots that we need to cover?
Not at all. I think we've covered the survey. People should just dive in and have a look themselves.
Yeah.
And again, pursue some of those links, find out more.
Yeah, I've linked the survey already, so find out for yourself if what we're talking about is genuine. We're telling the truth. That's what I like to do. And I will also link in the description the IPAN and the War Reforms website. So anyone in Australia who is interested, I would strongly recommend having a look at both of them. And I think, I don't know about War Reforms, but IPAN are looking for subscriptions and donations. They are doing some good work and very, very well worth supporting, in my opinion. So thank you very much, Warwick. And I know you have another to go to. Go and grab yourself a coffee and enjoy the next one. Thanks once again for your time and your brilliant mind. Okay, thank you. And everybody else, thank you for joining us today. We got over the 100, which is really good for this time of the day. And thanks very much for the questions and the information you put in there.